Hello, Anne. Thank you so much for joining me today. I was wondering if you could introduce yourself to everybody who's watching and listening.
Okay, yes, I'm Anne Charnock and I write near future science fiction. I have four published novels. Two deal with climate change, another deals with feminist issues surrounding reproduction and pregnancy. And my first novel was shortlisted for the Philip K. Dick Award. That's A Calculated Life. And my third novel, Dreams Before the Start of Time, won the Arthur C. Clarke Award. My latest book is Bridge 108, which is a climate change novel dealing with refugees being climate refugees coming into the UK, post-Brexit UK, from Mediterranean countries.
Yeah, something which I think is very, very pertinent at the moment. It's been quite scary this year looking at all of the weather events that have been happening across the
Yes.
world. But yeah, the temperatures that we had in the Mediterranean this year were really quite scary.
Yes, and I think we tend to think of further away places have it being impacted by climate change. You know, we think of drought in Africa and wildfires in California, and of course Australia, which has had an awful time. But my eldest son lives in Portugal, and I'm very much aware that they've had a terrible time about 4 years ago with wildfires. And at the time, I was already writing Bridge 108. So, in a way, I felt I wasn't predicting the future. It was already beginning to happen that the southern Mediterranean countries were being impacted by climate change far sooner than I think any of us expected. So suddenly I had a book which wasn't predicting what might happen. It was actually happening.
Yeah, yeah. So having started with really scary and um, worthy of nervousness conversations, I want to turn us to thinking about a more positive potential future, having spoken to the marvelous people that I sent you the briefing about,
Yes.
um, with the Green Skies project and the wind turbine project. It's what I'd like to do is to look at these two different examples and say, okay, how could this be replicated? If it was replicated, what could the impacts be? Because that's what we do as our job, right? We look at a particular detail, and then, in terms of the sci-fi that I write, I'll look at present day technology and say, well, I think it could plausibly develop in this way, and then it could have these impacts on the human experience. And I think that's what a lot of us do. That's how we approach our work. So I
Mm.
was wondering if you'd had some thoughts about looking at the way that Green Skies is approaching heating, cooling, energy infrastructure, and the wind turbine. What did it make you think about in terms of a future in which there was more of this sort of thing?
I thought there were such striking similarities between the two projects in that we've become so used, well, in Western Europe and in the UK, to seeing everything being centralised, that both these projects are trying to say, no, let's see what we can do in the local situation. Look at what we've got, what infrastructure we already have, or what resources we have. So there was already district heating in Islington.
That's right, yeah.
And in terms of the wind turbine, their resources were that they had lots of wind. So it's a question, I think, of looking at what's local. So I think what brought these two projects together was the idea of decentralization, bringing people and communities to the center of decision making rather than it being top down. But, it needs to be bottom up with a bit of clever thinking about assessing what do you have? What do you have that you can build on? And it might be, yes, it might be district heating. You've already got the system, people understand it. but it could be that you've got good opportunities, say on derelict land for solar power, or you've got roof space that you can use on a tower block for solar panels. So I think it came across quite clearly there that it was a question of doing feasibility studies, but bringing the decisions very close to the community.
Yeah, and I think that this is something, it made me think about that a lot too, that I feel like the first kind of 40, well, I just turned 47, and this is like the first year of my life, literally, where I've suddenly been looking at the system and going, I think I actually should be much more involved in this than I have been. I've lived such a privileged life of just going up to the light switch and pressing it and the light comes on. And, you know, in recent years, thinking about renewable energy, it's outside of my budget. I can't afford to have solar panels. I can't afford to do any of these things. But what these projects in particular made me realize was actually we need to come together. We need to come together in communities to achieve these things. And we actually do need to think about it. And we need to actively participate in a way that we're kind of discouraged
Yes.
to, you know, in doing in the way things are set up in modern day UK. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, I have once had solar panels on my previous home that was for water heating. And that was quite interesting because when it was a hot sunny day and I could see the temperature of the boiler going up to, of of the water tank going up to 39, 40 degrees, I would have a bath. So it was the weird situation of I would only have a bath on a sunny day. So you sort of become more attuned to your environment. It's like, oh, yeah, it's sun shining. Or I'd look at the temperature and it was like, oh, it's only about 33, not quite warm enough. So yes, I think these issues of being more in touch with your energy usage is really useful. And I think these smart meters, which I've had in one home, were very useful because you could literally go around the house and see what difference it made. And it puts you're more in tune then with your energy usage, which certainly we never used to be. And maybe AI could come into this so that we could be alerted to the fact that we've left something on. I'm just wondering if I should talk a little bit about the project that I was involved with in Ashton
I
Hayes.
was I was
Okay.
just about to ask you about that. Yeah, so you've got personal experience of something very similar to the two groups that the two examples in this
Yes.
podcast. So what was your personal experience of it, and how did that impact your life and the life of the community?
Well, actually, it took over my life completely for a few years. I was about halfway through writing my first novel when the community I lived in started a project aiming to be England's first carbon neutral village. And that was in 2005. I'd started my novel, A Calculated Life, in 2001, which had climate change in the background of that. But I would say that when we started the project in 2005, people were beginning to hear about climate change, but it wasn't really in the foreground of people's thoughts. So what we decided to do was not lead with technology. We decided we would get the parish council involved, we would use the parish council governance, and the village as a whole decided that they would aim to reduce their carbon footprint by conservation, energy conservation, lifestyle change. And the way we were able to measure this was that the University of Chester got involved because one of their lecturers lived in our community. So we started off by simple energy saving measures like looking at light bulbs, looking at reducing the temperature on thermostats, what have you. And it just became a community project. And there was no top down, there was no committee saying do this, do that. It was more individual citizens saying, I have an idea, let's try this. and everyone shared ideas if they were changing a boiler, which boiler to use. And then we persuaded the local council, because we were getting a lot of publicity, a lot of media attention, that we asked the council if they would build us a footpath from our village to the next village where there was a railway station, because it was too dangerous a road to walk along. And they agreed. So it was really great that we had that. Really building that footpath rather than building a turbine or anything was the big game changer. And it was a kind of a quick result. It came about 2-3 years into the project. And then we got local assistance from businesses, which allowed us to have some fun events. Like we made a video about the first year, and we did a film launch at the local school, and we had, cakes and English champagne, because English champagne was one of the positive outcomes of rising temperatures. So we just tried to have a lot of fun, and it was only after about 5 years when we found that the community was saving about 40% of their energy usage. It was at that point that the members of the community started saying, well, we've conserved as much as we can. We're making lifestyle changes. We're using the train more than the car, blah, blah, blah. What can we do now? And so then that's when people started saying, well, why don't we have a wind turbine? Why don't we have a wind turbine? Why don't we have solar panels? So in fact, it wasn't being imposed. Again, it was people saying, well, we can take control of this situation, wanting more ownership. And I would say, apart from the whole issue of reducing our carbon footprint, the main benefit was that in terms of people feeling happier, people feeling like they were doing something, and although the headlines were coming in all the time about climate change, and people were starting to feel a bit desperate in the kind of wider world, within Ashton Hayes, people's mental health was a lot better. This was not an expected outcome from the project.
I think that's fascinating. I think that's one of the things that, because I've done really quite a few interviews now for this season of the podcast, and it's not just everybody who's involved in these projects talking about the benefits from the thing they started doing together. It was all of the ripple effects from that, and increased engagement, decreases in loneliness, yes, improved mental health, and also just that fact of meeting kind of eco despair with, but I know that I'm doing what I can do, and I know that I'm doing that in a supportive community, is something that we need as social animals that we just have lost in so many areas of our lives.
What we found was that because of the success and because of the media attention, people started almost having this can-do attitude. If we identified a problem in the community, there would be a group say, well, we'll sort that out. Like, we started a community shop. We managed to get funding to build a sports pavilion with solar panels.
Wow.
People just felt energized. I think that's what I would say. And then we set up a community interest company that harnessed all the energy we were generating from solar panels on our sports pavilion and on the school, and use that energy to fund both the pavilion and the school, and the excess then sold to the grid. So that's still ongoing, and the money that's generated we spend on community projects. So it's kind of stopping the money leaving, and I think this is something that Daniel was talking about how the money is sucked out of a community, whereas it's ideal if you have a more independent energy generation project that you keep that money in your community.
Absolutely. And this is something, there's several community solar projects that have been happening in London that I've been reading about. And it's the very, very similar model of really working so hard to get that initial installation of solar panels in place and then using that to keep bringing the money back into the community. And that's what since, the 1980s, when everything changed with, neoliberal economics coming into play, that all of the wealth is being extracted out of society and going to a very small number of people at the top, that it feels that this is a way that tackles multiple problems at once. So I was thinking, if we had this situation where we had local community projects, micro energy generation projects with this economic model in place, do you think that if this was scaled up, across hundreds of communities, do you think that that could have a significant economic impact?
I think the main impact would be, as I mentioned earlier, that money was kept local rather than being extracted from our own resources, our own wind power, our own solar power. That we harness those resources for our good, rather than feeling as though we're being used. And I think it would perhaps restore a bit of faith in governance in general, that if people felt they had a little bit more control over their lives. I mean, the landscape, the cities and rural areas might change. You might start to see more windmills going up, see more solar farms, even methane digesters intercepting sewers. It could be that we have different infrastructure. And in a way, it's almost like a retro development, things being centralized, that centralization being relaxed. And, I sometimes think when you look back to centuries past, when infrastructure was that much more limited, and you would imagine, this idyllic scene with windmills being used to extract water, or windmills for grinding corn, and we think of that as kind of idyllic. It might not have been at the time, because of course windmills and corn mills, they were like could have been symbols of authority in a way, because not everybody trusted the miller in the local area. But we see them as this almost reminiscent of a bucolic era, when everybody lived close to the land. But I would like to think that we might see a slightly different landscape, certainly in rural areas, with each sizable community having its own energy generation. I mean, obviously, it's going to require work on the low voltage network, but I'm not a technical person, but it's not as straightforward as it might initially seem.
Yeah, there's various issues, aren't there, also in terms of managing fluctuations in availability of energy, and how you balance out when people need things the most with what's most readily available in terms of generation. But there are loads of really interesting developments in storage. There's a company, I can't remember whereabouts it was in Scandinavia, but they've developed a system where they basically have these huge cylinders which are filled with sand, and they're used to store heat energy, and they can store heat energy for months, literally months. So you could bank all of the heat that you get over a summer where you have readily available solar energy, or you could instead bank it over the winter with your wind energy. Whatever the fluctuations are seasonally, you can then physically store that heat that can then be used by the community again in times when that resource isn't as readily available. and they've been using it in kind of industrialized settings where they have businesses where they use renewables to effectively store up the energy in these sand containers, and then they can use it in their processes and in their power generation. And that kind of the thinking of it is a holistic thing was one of the things that I really loved about the Green Skies project, was
Yes.
looking at an entire an urban setting, but looking at an entire system and going, well, there's too much heat being generated here, so what if we could capture that and use the energy over here instead? And I love that, and I think that that is applicable in both rural and urban settings. It's just different ways, like the idea of having mining communities being able to use the flooded mines to reduce the cost of fuel and heating. That just seems, like a form of justice as well, having had all of that wealth extracted, having had the industry collapse and then being economically abandoned, to then be able to use what's left of that industry in such a positive way just seems incredible to me.
I think it seems clear that we've got the ideas and we've got the technology. We're not waiting for a silver bullet. These things are available now. I think the question is, who drives it? Who is it? Does it have to come down to an individual citizen to drive this? Is there sufficient willpower and enthusiasm within local government to drive this? Does it essentially come down to individuals, either in local government or in the community, to push this? I think that's one of the key questions for me. It's quite clear that these kind of projects arise at a local level, whereas we're used to the ideas coming from central government and being dropped on us. So there has to be a mind shift within local government and within communities to say, no, we can take control of the situation. We know what we've got to work with. Leave it to us. Give us the seed funding that we need to do the feasibility studies, and let's just get on with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the question that arises in my mind then is, okay, when you think about a local community and the people within it, who is able to take on that burden? Because in the early days, I would imagine that there is just, you said it, it took up your life for a big chunk of time, that, when we're all struggling to survive, I have 3 different jobs to try and stay afloat. There is no slack in my schedule to be able to do this kind of thing. So you have to have people within the community who do have more time as a resource to be able to kickstart these things, and that's an issue.
I am very aware of this. I know when I was younger, when my children were younger, I felt that families did have a bit more time available to put into the communities. I think now that's quite different, with people having multiple jobs, as you say. It's very, very difficult. And I think what is often happening, not always, but it's often happening, that a community is depending on the people who do have time, which is often semi-retired people or retired people. But what we did in the Ashton Hayes project was that we reached a point where, yes, probably all the active people in the project were getting to like the age of 45 plus. So there was a conscious effort to think in terms of having like a junior group of people, like members from the school, getting involved in, say, the community energy company, and trying to think in terms of having people to hand over the project to, so that it's not just elderly retired people, but basically donating a lot of time to these projects. And you also need younger people who are working professionally, who are up to date with technology, in terms of energy. I'd say one of the big problems that I've identified just observing these various community projects is when you're applying for grants, when you're applying for funding, you do need a level of professional expertise, which means that I think it's unfortunate that you can get into a situation where the funding goes into communities that do have more professional people, residents who are able to do those applications. So that in areas where there's deprivation, then there might be fewer people available to see those projects through in terms of applying for funding. So there needs to be an element of hand-holding and mentoring.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. So the feeling I'm getting is there's an inertia to overcome in the early stages, right? And that once you have that momentum, the impact, the positive impact of that project that you were talking about in your village, the mental health benefits, the energizing qualities of that, that it can then become more self-sustaining. And then if you get to the point where a community has the infrastructure in place to locally generate energy, has got money coming back into the community, which means that some of the burdens that people have had to take on to fill gaps in funding to make their lives work may be alleviated.
Well, that would be
And
nice.
it would be great, right? So
Yeah.
you could then have people who maybe don't have to work 3 jobs
Yes.
because there is a better and healthier local economy, and then they have the time and the resources to be able to reach out to other communities and say, hey, this is how we did this. We'll help you with your grant applications. And that if there is enough of a sea change at the grassroots level, that information sharing about how to do that could help to lift
Yes.
everybody up. And that's the kind of future that I'm getting glimpses of when
Yeah.
I'm looking at projects like this.
Well, one of the conditions that the parish council imposed on us was that if they were going to support the project, which we wanted them to support it so that it wasn't just a core of, a dozen people who were particularly invested in the idea. We wanted that governance as well from the parish council. They made the proviso that we had to share our ideas with other communities. So that was written in right at the beginning. And
Wonderful.
various people within the community have given, it must be hundreds of talks to other communities, either face to face or over virtual meetings. It's people have made lots of new friends. It's totally unexpected. We've got to see parts of the country that we would never have visited as part of the sharing of ideas. And
But
I
I think
think,
that's so beautiful. It's so wonderful.
it is. I mean, it was a good community anyway. There was a sense of cohesion in the community. And I think probably what really helped to get the project off the ground with the parish council was that we got the local primary school involved right from the beginning. So we would hold our events at the school, and we would have the children do energy related projects. So they would go on display. So all the parents came to the events, all the grandparents came to the events. So we did try to make it fun. And I would say there was never any finger pointing. That was one of our main rules at the beginning. We weren't going to go around pointing fingers saying, oh, they're driving such and such a car. There was none of that, because I think it just takes some people a bit more time to come round to the idea, and they don't want to feel like they're being criticised. Nobody likes that.
Absolutely. And if there's another conversation that I had very recently where we were talking about a project. This is involving the monitoring of waterways and the water quality. And you might have heard of it, the Biosphere project in Devon, where they had sensors in one of the main rivers that feeds into a beach that they wanted to retain the clean swimming status for. But there were pollution problems, and so what they did was they engaged everybody who lives along the river, all of the landowners, the stakeholders, all of the people, and explained, we're not doing this to find somebody to punish. We want to help each other to keep our river as clean as possible, and we will help you to do that. And it was that fundamental positive, no finger pointing, no threat of punishment, but we want to do this together and we will help each other to achieve it, that made it such a success. Yes. And I think that's one of the things with all of these projects that I'm thinking about, like various examples that we have in popular television and the media of like, oh, these things have gone wrong, or look, this community project started and now they're all fighting with each other because they're looking for a story. They're looking for some kind of conflict. But in talking to people, yourself, the other people that I've spoken to in this project, that, there are obviously going to be problems. There are obviously going to be disagreements, but there are so many communities that are already doing this and are already successful, that this could be scaled up. This could be repeated in many, many, many places.
It could be scaled up. And as you say, in dramas, they are literally looking for drama. And in science fiction too, there's the issue of, especially with near future science fiction, yes, you want to look at the possibilities for technology, but quite often, even if new technologies are being presented in fiction, it's often in the against a backdrop of a dystopia. Okay, so it's fundamentally negative story. So that's something of a dilemma, and quite often dystopias are looking at stratification of society and how it's being stretched further and further, and how does technology impact that. I mean, when I wrote Bridge 108, I was very interested in looking at how an area could be more self-sufficient. So the more disadvantaged people in society are living out in enclaves. But they're more self-sufficient than you would expect, in that I was very interested in aquaponics. So I decided...
Oh, I love aquaponics.
I decided that each enclave would have their own aquaponics setup. A fish farm with the waste being used for vertical agriculture. And alongside that, there would be a power from waste plant, and these two were working together. So this sounds quite utopian, doesn't it? Providing employment, producing fish and vegetables for the local enclave, energy generation so that there's subsidized fuel. But as I say, it's a dystopia because the people who are working at the fish farm and who are working in the power from waste plant are climate refugees. They're indentured labour. So I think this is the difficulty for science fiction. It can produce positive ideas, but it's often couched in less than optimistic terms. I mean, you get a writer like Kim Stanley Robinson with Ministry for the Future, and I'm sure this book will be referenced quite often.
Yep.
Coming up with positive ideas, yet within the drama of conflict, political conflict, over the way to go ahead. But Kim Stanley Robinson, it does manage to present new ideas without totally dressing it up as a dystopia. It's a challenge, there's no doubt about it.
It is, and I think about, you know, the most robust utopia that we have in pop culture, which is Star Trek, right? And that's very,
Mm.
very, very far future, and it's ultra high tech, and is still very flawed, even though in many ways it's fantastic. There is still the elements of, you know, frontierism and that
Yes.
kind of thing.
Mm.
But the thing that I'm thinking, having looked at all of these places today, here today, where we're looking at the intersection of modern day technology and positive community action, that we already have everything we need. And I totally agreed with Daniel when he said in the interview, I think we do have everything we need, and actually the Centre for
Yes.
Alternative Technology has already written the blueprint. It's just implementing it that I think that instead, where I think the emphasis in a positive vision of the future would be is all of the community grassroots actions that we've already talked about, but then also through that starting to examine the supply chain for all of this already existent technology and saying, okay, where are these materials coming from? How are the people in those communities treated? Is there a way that through our own empowerment as communities, we can help those communities in solidarity and to lift everybody up to have a positive impact on a global scale by dismantling the structures of colonialist extraction and exploitation.
Mm.
You know, this is one of the things that I like to daydream as, you know, if local communities are doing this, what
Yes.
is that outward effect?
Well, in a way, it is happening by stealth because local people are starting these projects with university help, as we had with Chester, or with local government support and grants. It is happening, and it will proliferate because people will share their ideas. So sometimes you don't need government to change the mind, you just get on with it.
Yeah, and you know, when I've been having this thought as well myself, and I was thinking, if we're solving our own problems in terms of energy generation, in terms of how we process our own waste, how we look at food infrastructure and community farming projects and everything, it's like, okay, government's starting to look like something which is kind of getting in the way in terms of those legislative blocks that Daniel was talking
Yes.
about. That the thing that I would hope would be that there would be such a pressure from society to start to reflect this in legislation and policy that
Well,
it has to
politicians are the
change.
block. Politicians are the block.
Yes.
And um, they unfortunately the downside of democracy is that our politicians are only thinking in terms of a short-term election cycle.
Yep.
So they're not really serving the citizens because they're too self-interested. So that's in the nature of a democracy, and we have to find ways to make politicians realise that there are votes in taking bold measures. And I think there's too much thinking about pandering to factions within their own political parties that's holding us up. I mean, we can see that with wind power, that with this block on onshore wind, I mean, it's just ridiculous. Again, that's pandering to a minority within the party. But I think it's beginning to come through, and it'll probably because of political focus, running focus groups to find out that yes, people do want this. We do want to clean up the air. We are disgusted with the state of our rivers and our coastlines. And how has this come about? How could they let this happen when they were warned about what the impact of outside funding in our public utilities was going to result in? They knew this, and yet they're not acting in our interests. So hopefully the message is getting through. And I think particularly with the water authorities, with their disgraceful attitude towards sucking money out of the industry, again, it's on a big scale. I think everybody now understands what the implications are of having nationalised industries sold off to the wrong kind of people, to the
Yes.
wrong kind of institutions. So
Yeah.
everybody knows the story now. It's out there.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting with greater, not only public awareness, but public anger.
Mm.
And, the waterways is a really good example of that. But I'm also seeing more conversation about, hang on a minute, why are fossil fuel companies receiving so much state money? That's our money. Why is this happening? Why are the banks propping up these industries? What could happen if the government stopped this, just stopped giving licenses for new drilling, stopped propping up those industries and diverted those funds to seed funding all of these local community energy projects? What an incredible thing that could be. What an incredible shift in terms of making this happen. Because if you had suddenly had the those funds diverted and there wasn't so much stress and competition about applying for small pots of grant funding, that may have a really big impact, a really
It,
big positive impact.
it would be wonderful. I mean,
It would.
we can imagine it, we can see it, and it just takes a few decisions to get us onto the right path. And
Yeah.
the problem is the way government gets its funding or its elections, the way they have to deal with lobbyists. It's a form of corruption, so that we as citizens don't get what we want and what we all know is the right way forward. So we just have to work hard to make our democracies better.
Yes. Yes. So I'm thinking about one of the things I loved about what you said about what your former village did was first to change lifestyle with no technology changes, and that can be done now. And I think a lot of us have been doing that, particularly this year because of the energy crisis. People who've never thought about their bills necessarily before have suddenly been forced to think about it. People who were worried before have been in crisis, and it's impacted so many more people than ever before. But I was thinking about you mentioning AI and a potentially positive use of AI, where there are systems that are designed to help us to use energy more efficiently. What would it be like living in a world where we had systems like this, where we had community energy projects? Would we wake up in the morning and look at how much energy is in the batteries and
Be that say at the weekend and you're catching up with chores and you've got the washing machine going, and then you've got the coffee machine on or whatever and you're using the Hoover or what have you. It could be an AI system would flag up that actually your energy consumption at this moment is peaking. It says don't use the Hoover now. Don't use the Hoover, or the Hoover doesn't switch on because your energy consumption is already too high at that moment, just to help balance out demand, peak demand, keep that peak demand down. So I don't know, it could be a very positive thing in helping people to keep their energy consumption less spiky. I mean, this is what has to happen in some Scottish islands where there's limited power supply, and so you can't use two energy hungry appliances at the same time. So I think it's it's not re-education. I think people are willing to think in a different way. I mean, look at
I,
how we all had to cope with our lives turned upside down by the pandemic. You know, we are capable of changing, and it's just uh, approaching our day-to-day lives with a slightly different mindset.
yeah, I think that for some people that is an unpleasant thought that they can't just do what they've always done whenever they want to. But
Mm.
I wonder if thinking about the mental health benefits of living in a way that is more connected to nature and to the changing of the seasons, that I think that a lot of these habits of just buying stuff and having energy hungry devices to fill these gaps that we have in our souls now, it feels like, you know, there is so many things that are making us, that are starving us about the modern world, that if we start to shift things more towards community participation, being involved in projects that make people more aware of natural resource fluctuations and the weather and how we live in harmony with it, that there may be an initial period of pain in a way, but that ultimately over the mid to long term, there will be other benefits that aren't necessarily readily apparent.
Yes, I think that's kind of easier to achieve in a rural area. I mean, in an urban area, in a suburban street, or in a high-rise block, you have to think a bit more creatively, I think, um, to connect people on this kind of subject. Yeah, it's quite easy in a rural area. People are more aware of the weather.
Yeah, you're right. And I was thinking that I wonder if there is also a difference in need to do that depending on where you are. So if you're in an urban setting and you have data centers that are 100 yards down the road, that maybe you don't have to worry as much about whether there's enough energy to do something because there is so much already there that's being used better. I mean, just the London Underground overheating progressively as the decades go
Yeah.
by, if that heat could be extracted from the network with heat pump technology, we would cool the transport system,
Yes.
but also potentially give people really, really cheap ways to heat their homes. So
Yes.
there's an abundance in the urban environment that doesn't exist in the rural
It's true,
setting. It's
actually.
just different.
I think say in London, people are aware of climate in different ways. In that, when it's hot weather, people don't take the central line unless they can
Yep.
really avoid it. Everyone's thinking, oh, can I use, this Circle and District line because it's overground more, it's, not as deep down. So yes, people are willing to adjust uh, their routines depending on the weather. Maybe everybody's going to move to Scotland. I don't know.
I having seen how what you see out of your window, I'm really tempted just to just go. I want to live somewhere that beautiful. I mean, I'm ultimately planning to move back to the countryside, but yeah,
All right.
it's one of those things that I think that it's an interesting time in terms of population movement, and obviously your book has also looked at this in terms of migration, but looking at areas of the world where they have villages that are dying and that they're selling houses for €1 to encourage people to come back to regenerate those. And that it feels to me, it feels so frustrating because there are so many places where they desperately need people to go and live there that are still viable in terms of climate. It's just that the economy has drawn everybody to the urban centres when you have thousands upon thousands of people who are displaced because of climate that cannot live where they want to live. It's like that we could solve both of these problems if we just had friendlier border policy and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's something that we've got to learn to live with, the fact that people are going to be moving. This is happening on a countrywide continent-wide, globally, that people are moving. It's not that you don't think in terms of one mass bulk of people living. It's lots of individuals making individual decisions that they would be safer if they moved, or they could have a better standard of living if they moved to this area that was cheaper to live or cooler to live. So it's just the way the world works that people do move. Like you have the digital nomads moving to Portugal,
Yep.
creating distortions in the housing market. So this is just the way human beings operate. They make their own decisions about where to live, where to work, and it's managing that without causing friction.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting times. In some ways, very, very good, and in some ways, quite scary. But I like to think with things like these community based, decentralized, renewable energy projects that this could have such a beneficial impact in terms of local economy, in terms of mental health, in terms of decarbonisation. There are so many benefits that, as you say, it's already happening. It's already happening, and we just need the government to get out of the way. It feels like.
Just make the key decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, there is so, like you said, there are certain things which would have such a big positive impact that are quite simple to see now, and it's just ideology that's getting in the way.
Yes, it is. I mean, allow onshore wind turbines sited in the right places, of course. Really invest in peatland restoration. I mean, that's really key as well for the UK. It's just a question of politicians waking up to what people actually want and what they expect politicians to make these decisions. They can't leave it all to us as individuals to make things happen in our local communities.
Yeah, because it always comes down to time and money, right?
Mm.
If you can have people in the community who have the time to get over that initial inertia to get the momentum in the project, then the next thing you need is always going to be money. And if that seed funding could come from the government to local communities to do projects like this instead of other uses,
Yes.
to respond to lobbyists that prop up the fossil fuel industry, then that could have just such a huge impact. That's the future I want to live in, where communities are actively helped and subsidized to do these things because it's better for everybody. I can't see how, aside from supply chain issues and whether the materials that are going into these projects, how they're extracted, how the communities where that extraction takes place are being taken care of, if that could also be massively improved and safeguarded, and a circular economy developed in terms of recycling these things at end of life and creating new things. It's already there. It just needs tweaking in terms of systems and where the money goes. Yeah. Okay.
I want to live in that utopia.
I do too. Yeah, I would like to live there too. Yeah, what a wonderful thing. So, if people have listened to our conversation and they want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find you online?
I have a website that's just my name, www.annecharnock.com. I'm on the usual social media channels, less so on Twitter or X. I'm on Threads and Instagram, again, just my name, @Anne Charnock, and on Blue Sky. So hopefully see you there, and let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Let's imagine this future and then make it happen. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful talking to you.
It's been great.
Let's go build this future. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.